This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Kids are getting fatter. You see it in schools, and the UK is a leader in the getting fatter and sicker stakes. Can we change that? Well, 30 years of government-led obesity strategies and the like say no. But there are two cities showing how to get results, Leeds and Amsterdam. And they haven't done it by focusing on diet. This is the Food Programme. I'm Sheila Dillon, and I'm here with those city stories of success. Here's a simple question. If children are a country's future, what does Britain's future look like when so many of our children start primary school already obese and seemingly on the downward slope to chronic sickness? And that's not because our nation has lacked policies meant to make our children healthier.
We've had 30 years of government obesity policy, and since then we've had 14 government obesity strategies containing almost 700 individual policies, and yet no reduction in the prevalence of obesity or related inequalities. I kept describing it as going absolutely bananas on this merry-go-round, doing the same thing again and again, like the sort of typical sign of madness. But the more you sort of dive into the detail of why, you start to understand why it is that we've had that situation.
I've been reporting on this for years on the Food Programme, and the long story of our declining health is depressing. We Brits are European leaders in the obesity business. No other high-income country can match us, apart from the USA and Canada. In February, the Academy of Medical Sciences reported stark evidence of poor health among the under fives in the UK, with scary rates of obesity and tooth decay. Maybe it isn't surprising at all. Look around. The causes of obesity are complicated. More and more cheap, sweet, highly processed snacks and drinks available almost everywhere, on top of increasing poverty and inequality. But there might be glimmers of hope for a better future. People, policymakers, politicians, are gradually accepting that the issue is complex, that obesity isn't an individual problem of willpower, unless millions of us all lost our willpower at exactly the same time. In a community centre in the London suburbs, a group of new parents have come to learn about one of the most crucial points for their babies in growing into good health, the move from milk to solid foods.
I think the key thing we want parents to take away from this workshop is that confidence and offer that variety so that the babies do get that sort of opportunity to explore lots of different tastes and flavours.
Starting off with those healthy habits can really be great at setting the tone for the rest of their eating throughout their childhood, throughout teenage years, as well as lifetime.
I'm Sheila Dillon, and in this edition of the Food Programme, we're going to look at two different stories that show change is possible. In the decade or so before the pandemic, the cities of Leeds and Amsterdam became the first places in the world to actually lower numbers of fat, unhealthy children. Amsterdam's Healthy Weight programme became famous around the world for its bold citywide approach involving parents, health workers, schools, sports centres, community leaders and politicians.
We agreed that a neighborhood approach would be the best thing, and also that we had to change the normal understanding of childhood obesity, which was that obesity is an individual problem that needs to be managed by eating less and moving more, and it's the responsibility of parents and children to do so. We actually turned that around and said obesity is actually an environmental problem, social environment, physical environment, and they shape actually the behavior of children in general, and it will take a long-term perspective to change that.
Leeds' success in cutting child obesity rests in part on its work with the Henry charity, that's health, exercise and nutrition for the young. They work with families all across the UK. In Leeds, they've trained health workers and run 8-week family programs, helping parents grow in confidence while they learn skills that will set them and their children up for a healthy future.
I think it really is one of the most powerful catalysts for change that I'm aware of. I don't think any of us like being told what to do. So actually just being given information is probably one of the least effective ways of changing people's behaviour. I think when people feel heard and involved in thinking about what they want to change and get the support to make those changes, that's when we really can make a difference.
These two remarkable interventions are really about creating the conditions for good health, about acknowledging that what surrounds us shapes us. They're about creating healthy food environments in the family and in all the surrounding places where a child comes into contact with food. So, after 30 years of UK government policies ringingly announced as the way to tackle obesity, and 30 years of us getting fatter, what can we learn from what's been done in Leeds and Amsterdam? Well, let's find out.
The main thing that helped from the Henry course was that you need to be persistent. You need to try a food about 15 times. And she is brilliant now. She eats all sorts of vegetables and fruits. Tomatoes, carrots, peas. She really likes broccoli, so big improvement.
We looked at behaviour and how you can manage behaviour better, how you introduce new things. It's what do you as a family want to work on and how can we do that? And that's been invaluable to us as a family. 2
Leeds parents on Henry's benefits for them. Kim Roberts is the charity's CEO.
I think all of us would agree that once a habit is there, it is really hard to turn around. And food is a really core, embedded preference habit. It's really hard to change the kinds of foods that we like eating. So what we're really thinking about is how do we help to make sure that children get those healthy food preferences and those healthy attitudes to eating right at the beginning, rather than forming less healthy food preferences and trying to undo them later.
The shocking statistic that everybody knows is the high percentage of children going into primary school now who are already obese. But your approach seems to acknowledge that preventing obesity doesn't just start with what children eat. It's a much broader, more complex problem.
It is. It's about environment and it's about the wider family. Children develop habits from the people around them, recognising that parents who've got pretty solid well-being are much more likely to think about making healthy changes, and that for any of us, when we're stressed, there's a limit to what else we can cope with. So we're looking at emotional well-being in the family. We're also looking at the confidence and knowledge and skills of parents themselves, because there's a big difference between knowing what's an unhealthy snack and actually having the strategies, the confidence to hold those boundaries.
I don't think anybody would disagree with what you've just said, but the question is, how do you get families to engage with this?
Absolutely. And I think that's where the Henry approach comes in, because we are not about telling people what to do. We recognise that families are doing the very best they can in the circumstances in which they find themselves. We recognise that parents want the very best for their children. So we start with the reality of parents' lives and hear from them what they're struggling with. We help them think about changes that they feel would help them to provide healthier meals and snacks for their children as well as for themselves. And then, crucially, we help them to think about how can they do that in the way that would work for them and their families.
Henry works with around 70 to 80 local authorities commissioned through the public health budget. They partner with councils to train health teams, or they run workshops and courses directly to parents. Workshops like this one. We're in Waltham Forest, a suburb of North London, sitting on the sidelines as a Henry team run a starting solids workshop. Parents, mostly mothers, but a couple of dads, with their 4 to 6 month olds are sat in a circle of colourful baby mats and cushions, talking about helping their babies to eat well from the get-go.
My name's Cara and this is George, and he's just over 5 months. I would say that probably myself and my husband got into bad habits, like just sit in front of the TV and eat. But now with him, we've made a conscious effort to sit at the table, make sure he's watching us and just make it more of a family experience. So yeah, there will definitely have to be some changes. But hopefully, I aspire to we're all eating the same thing. So that's kind of where I want to work towards, rather than he eats something different and then we eat something different.
My name is Esther Ogunakaro. I'm one of the Henry Healthy Families practitioners here in Henry Waltham Forest. Starting solids well, we'd have to think about introducing a lot of savoury foods at first, because we know parents that might introduce sweeter foods at first, it can lead to sometimes fussy eating. When the parents are calm, then baby is also calm and more receptive to trying those foods. So we really focus on the family atmosphere when introducing these foods.
So in a way, are you also helping people to think about how to navigate the food system themselves?
Yeah, definitely. So we're trying to just encourage people to be empowered, really, to know how to navigate the food environment, as you said. And we do have quite an obesogenic environment where everything that is advertised to us can sometimes be over-processed or be really high in fat and high in sugar. So hopefully from this workshop, what parents do get is that it's much simpler than they think. Letting baby have those normal tastes that we would eat as well.
So my name's Hannah. I've got a 6-month-old boy called Kanan, who's waking up now to join the interview.
And grab the microphone, quite rightly. Why did you sign up for this workshop?
Well, it's really nice to be able to talk and listen to other people rather than just read it online. I feel like sometimes it's a bit overwhelming, the amount of information out there. My mother-in-law will be like, baby rice, and I should start with rusk and putting that in his milk. And then my mum will be like, vegetables only, no meat. And it's what was told to them at the time. Yeah. And I think it's just making sure that I'm not overlooking anything.
What reassured you about, these 2 hours?
There's just so much more variety than you would think. It's not just purees and things from the supermarket. You can make it fun. You can involve your own eating routine and make that with theirs, and I think that's really nice as well.
What would you say to the government, to the supermarkets, the food manufacturers, that would help make things easier for you?
I think the baby aisle is seen as the font of everything you'll need for your baby. That's actually not it. You can feed your baby from every other aisle. It doesn't need to just be the purees. And I think it's just making that more clear. You're directed to that aisle because you think that's where you need to be, but you actually don't at all.
Children are getting fatter. In almost every part of the country, obesity rates are rising. Everywhere apart from Leeds. The improvement was particularly noticeable in deprived areas where usually the problem is worse, and it's thought that's because of an 8-week course by the private charity Henry.
In 2008, Leeds City Council decided to work with Henry, focusing on preventing preschool children getting fat. 10 years later, Leeds made national headlines, becoming the first city in the UK to see a small but significant drop in childhood obesity overall, but a big drop, 10%, in the poorest areas.
Leeds is a really good case study of a city in the UK that has really invested in early intervention and prevention around its healthy child weight strategy. There's an awful lot of contact with young families at the beginning of a child's life. So we wanted to make sure that all of those contacts were supported to be as effective as possible. We've trained, getting on for 1,500 practitioners across Leeds. So all of the health visiting workforce, the community, healthcare assistants, the children's centre staff. It equips them with the skills, the confidence, the insights to have conversations that will really help to make a difference. They say, now I've done the Henry training, I talk less and I listen more.
That could be a mantra for life, right?
One of my personal mantras is empathy before education. So that's a big part of what's been embedded in Leeds right across the city. It's so that parents are getting that consistent approach, that very effective behaviour change approach. And then the other part of that is that in the children's centres in the city, 90 programmes a year, they're absolutely part and parcel of what parents expect as a normal part of the support that they get as a young family.
And of course the statistics bear out the value of that way of doing things, doesn't it? Because it's the most economically deprived areas that show the biggest drop in childhood obesity.
I think that was what was so exciting about that 2019 study that Oxford University did on obesity rates in Leeds, because it shows that we can do something to really reverse the terrible inequalities that children and families face.
Kim, was there anything in particular about the city of Leeds, about the structures there, that led to this really rather remarkable success?
Leeds is a real example of joined up strategic vision across the council. What we had in public health was a commissioner with real vision around embedding support for child healthy weight. So that was really the public health vision. As a city council, Leeds have prioritised early years and keeping their children's centres open, which many local authorities have not been able to do or have not chosen to prioritise. You've got a focus within those deprived areas for family support.
Kim Roberts. But it's across the channel where the greatest success in nurturing healthy children is found, in Amsterdam. Their programme, at first called Healthy Weight, has become famous around the world.
It started off as the realization that actually the childhood obesity figures in Amsterdam were higher than generally in the Netherlands. So that always looks terrible for politicians. They're responsible for something they don't manage very well.
Professor Jaap Seidel is Professor of Nutrition and Health at the Free University in Amsterdam, one of the experts who put together the plan with Amsterdam's mayor, civil servants and politicians. Their mantra was, the healthy choice should be the easy choice.
So usually politicians don't think further than 4 years at best. And in this case, they agreed, this was 2012, that they would have an horizon of at least 20 years to solve this. So the time perspective, the collective responsibility, the environmental dimensions of this problem made it, I think, different from what was going on before.
The programme was designed to work on many fronts at once across the city, a whole systems approach, they call it. Amsterdam also had a charismatic deputy mayor for healthcare and sport, Erik van der Burg, whose bold political leadership helped some radical changes, including a ban on fast food advertising at sporting events and a water and milk only policy in schools. There were community cooking classes, subsidised sports activities for low-income families, and health counselling for parents on the first 1,000 days of a child's life. The role of that politician, Erik van der Burg, was crucial.
He is a member of a conservative party in the Netherlands, so usually they are very reluctant to change environments and to influence people's behavior because they think it's all, self-responsibility and things like that. But he saw that the obesity problem was exacerbated by all these sports activities for children that were sponsored by the food industry, candy, soft drinks, all kinds of other things. And he said, I can't reconcile responsibility for obesity and health if I allow people to advertise unhealthy foods and drinks to children. I can't allow it to be served in schools. So he was instrumental in having a long-term vision, also realizing that this is a socio-economic, cultural and environmental problem. He decided to work on this because the growth and development of children in Amsterdam and the big social disparities there are not just creating health problems on the short term, but they are also creating lots of other problems on the long term.
Governments in this country, they are reluctant to get involved in anything like you have been describing, because it's this idea that this is the nanny state.
Well, there are two things. One is that idea that there's a nanny state is a framing of particularly the industry and some political streams in the country. But it's actually the other way around. The nanny is really the food industry. They determine what you eat and what you drink. They have a strong influence on what's available, and they strongly undermine the health of children. And in order to do your political duty, you have to protect children from unhealthy elements in your societies. Children have the right to clean air, to safe drinking water. They also have a right to healthy food environments. So it is a particular brand of conservatism, which is called, I think, libertarian paternalism, in which you say, people have, of course, the freedom to choose, but I will make the healthy choice easier. because I can't ask people to change their choices if that choice is more expensive, less available, less convenient. So yes, he still is a firm believer of autonomy and responsibility, but he realized also that you need to take action for people to make that feasible. If you have low income, you have no time, no opportunities to do so, then you should actually invest in people to make that happen.
What about parents? Was there resistance, conflict about the new food rules in schools, the ban on fizzy drinks, for example?
There's always some in the beginning, but in the long run, usually it takes about a few months and then people are used to it. It is just the rules. You make it also clear, we're not saying parents should not give their children sweets, candy, snacks, whatever, but don't do it at school, because actually you're undermining the autonomy of the other children. It's much easier if you do these things at home and not at school. In general, there were some parents that were threatening to take their kids out of school or then not to participate in the activities. But then the children themselves said, I want to join everybody else. I want to be part of what's going on, and it's just nice. The evaluation afterwards is that parents, children, and school teachers were all happy with the result. They saw it in the school performance and, the mental health of children also. Yeah, so there's not much disagreement there.
We hear from city officials that the Amsterdam Healthy Weight Programme, as it was, has now developed and morphed into something broader. So what are these changes and why were they made?
Well, there are several. First of all, it is the focus on obesity is a bit narrow approach. It became clear, especially during the COVID epidemic, that also mental health of children was deteriorating. There was a strong call for paying attention to other dimensions of health as well. A further realization that came about also during COVID is that mental health, physical health, nutrition and obesity and immune system are also linked. So it became a broader approach about healthier environments for children that are conducive to all of these aspects.
That must be hard. I mean, it's easy to weigh children. It's much harder to measure all the things you're talking about.
Yes, that's absolutely true. But we do measure that. It's pretty much centralized. So everything that has to do with youth from 0 to 19 years of age is all covered by the Municipal Health Service. That is, I think, different from the UK. So mental health, infectious diseases prevention, physical health and obesity and things like that, they are all resorting under the same roof, but also where lots of different information is gathered, which you can link and you can have policies also implemented much more broadly in that sense.
Is public health well funded in the Netherlands? It sounds as though it is.
Well, it could be much better, but public health is much broader than just what the Ministry of Health spends on it. It's also money of education and of infrastructure and of employments and things like that. So if all these budgets are taken together, yes, you can have a big impact on public health. And I think it's to combine all these elements that makes it possible to have enough funding for this.
Professor Jaap Seidel in Amsterdam. Adequate funding, strong political leadership across parties, and long-term thinking all appear to be crucial in Amsterdam's success. So what can local authorities here do about the health of the public? Alice Wiseman is Joint Director of Public Health for Gateshead and Newcastle.
I think the best local authorities in the country see themselves as public health organisations to make sure that health is part of every policy decision that's made. The move of public health from the NHS back into local government in 2013 was the right place for them to be. And the reason that they are the right place is because all of the actions that are undertaken by local authorities, whether that's economic development, whether that's housing policy, whether that's planning, all have an impact on health and well-being.
What effect have you seen of cuts to local government from central government over the last few years?
I mean, to be honest with you, working in a local government, it's absolutely devastating. We've seen many of the services that we provide to our communities be significantly reduced. And actually what we've ended up doing is often firefighting because you aren't able to put the preventative services in that you would particularly like to put in. And instead you are responding to people when they presenting crisis. When you look across the whole of local government, that safety net, I think, has been really, really damaged. And we are seeing that in the outcomes now. While life expectancy might be increasing for some of our more affluent communities, it's reducing in our most deprived communities. And for me, that's not acceptable, and it is a choice.
Well, tell us about the situation in Gateshead with children's diets and health and what you've been able to do there to improve the situation.
In Gateshead, sadly, the picture is not improving. And I think, many places up and down the country have seen the same thing. Over 1 in 10 of our children start reception either overweight or obese. And a third of our year 6 kids, are living with obesity. And when I look to the adult population, again, it's about 2/3 of the whole population who are living with either overweight or obesity. So it is a problem that at the moment, even despite lots of really good work, we're not making progress on it. And again, this is really where we need to see some national approaches. We do need to think about poverty. Poverty for families is a real driver of obesity.
So what would you say are the knock-on effects to those children's lives and their long-term health and the cost to society of that?
Well, it's massive. The cost to individuals and to communities is huge. We know that obesity is one of the leading causes of type 2 diabetes. We know that this is significantly growing in terms of NHS pressure. The challenge that we've got is that people seem to think that it's an easy solution. That if we just tell people what they should be eating, that actually then people should be able to do that. But the reality is we know that that isn't true. And actually our food environment and the choices that we make around the food that we do consume is shaped by the world around us. And what we do see is we see marketing and influencing of children and young people from a very, very young age to eat ultra-processed food. All of those sort of simple nudges that the industry are able to put in, and we really need to think about how we protect children because we are never, ever going to be able to treat our way out of this problem. This requires a whole societal shift. Committing to doing one shiny policy intervention and then ticking the box and saying that's done will never, ever tackle this.
So what powers do local authorities have to develop healthier food environments for the people who live there?
So, I'm seeing lots of really exciting work that's going on up and down the country. For example, in Gateshead, we haven't had a new planning application for a hot food takeaway since 2015. And that's because when we developed our policy, we said that we weren't going to have any hot food takeaways planning applications approved where children and young people could congregate, where there were high levels of obesity, where there was already an overproliferation of hot food takeaways, which again we know is more linked to deprived communities. So actually we've had no new planning applications since 2015 and we've actually seen an overall reduction in the prevalence in the borough. The challenge you've got is we do that in Gateshead and then you've got these Just Eat and these dark kitchens setting up that deliver food to the home. So as quickly as we're finding a solution, the industry are finding a way around it. We haven't done this yet in my areas, but I know that there are colleagues elsewhere in the country that have done some amazing work around advertising. There's Transport for London system, for example, that reduced advertising for ultra-processed food. And what they actually saw was 1,000 calorie reduction in the families who would have been exposed to that advertising on the way to school and the way to work as a result. So there are some really great bits of work that are going on, but really what we need is national approaches to sit alongside this work. The real critical importance for improving public health is having that joint working between national and local government.
It sounds like you think one of the main barriers to local authorities taking effective action on obesity is this lack of a central government policy. Is that right?
Yeah, I do think that it's absolutely desperate that we get some action at a national level, whether it's about reformulation of food, whether it's about introducing mandatory reporting for some of the larger food companies, whether it's about reducing the availability of unhealthy food advertising, expand the Healthy Start scheme. And I think that there needs to be some really clear targets for longer term change. I think giving communities some resources to be able to solve the problems themselves would be a step. I do think if I had more money, I would talk about free school meals and extending the eligibility there. Breakfast clubs that aren't necessarily funded by some of the big food companies, because we know that they have a vested interest in funding those breakfast clubs, because actually it's again about brand recognition. So I think that there needs to be, a whole range of things and additional resources at a local level would help, of course. But I do think that there are some things that happen better at national level. It needs to be much more longer term focused. I love the work in Wales they're doing around the Future Generations Act. What does this policy objective mean for our future generations? And I think asking yourself that question on all of the policy decisions that are made at a government level from a health perspective. So at a local level, we call that health in all policies. I think that could be something that was replicated nationally, and then we would start to have these longer term conversations around prevention rather than trying to find short term quick solutions for things that, as you've said, are far more complex.
Alice Wiseman, Director for Public Health in Newcastle and Gateshead. As she said, health policy is the responsibility of central government in England. Governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have developed their own strategies.
I almost naively proposed the idea of going, why is it that we've had all these hundreds of policies and yet no reduction in the prevalence of obesity and related inequalities in that time? Why is that happening?
The question that set Dr. Dolly Van Tullochen off on her PhD thesis about government obesity policies in England over the last 30 years. Policies like this one, announced in the House of Commons in 2018.
Minister Steve Brine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, Government have published the second chapter to our child obesity plan. This plan is informed by the latest evidence and sets a new national ambition to halve childhood obesity and significantly reduce the gap in obesity between children from the most and least deprived areas by 2030.
Dolly Van Tullochen is now a food policy specialist and visiting researcher at the Medical Research Council's Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge.
I genuinely had my jaw to the desk through most of the research because it wasn't just the sheer number of policies that had been proposed over the last 30 years, but it was also the fact that there seemed to be this sort of repeated cycle of announcements and so little follow through. And sort of when you look at it over the cycle of different governments, different parties, different prime ministers, different secretaries of state for health, that the sort of same or very similar policy ideas have been proposed again and again in that time. I kept describing it like going absolutely bananas on this merry-go-round, doing the same thing again and again, like the sort of typical sign of madness. And so I found that particularly fascinating.
The UK government first formally recognised obesity as a problem in the early 1990s. Dolly's research showed that since then there have been 14 government-led obesity strategies in England, starting with the Health of the Nation White Paper in 1992, and the first obesity reduction targets to the most recent 2020 obesity strategy, published by Boris Johnson, still technically being carried out today, though many of the measures have since been scrapped or delayed. So the result of all that is while 15% of adults were obese in 1993, by 2021, it had reached 26% of all adults.
But the more you sort of dive into the detail of why, you start to understand why it is that we've had that situation. But the three main reasons are essentially the types of policies being one. So government has tended to propose policies that try and get people to change their own behaviour without making that easy by shaping the environment around them. And we know from research that that is less likely to be effective and equitable. It's likely to increase the gap between those who can afford and have the opportunity to live healthier lives and those that don't. And then the second thing is that the regulation approach that government has taken has tended to be a voluntary regulation approach, rather than introducing a mandatory measure that might have a consequence if that sector doesn't act, which could be, something in law, or it could be a taxation. The government has really erred away from that kind of approach. And then the third main issue is what we've alluded to already, is the lack of implementation. So policies tend to be proposed in a way that is very, very unlikely that they're going to be implemented, because so few policies are proposed with really basic pieces of information, like 91% with no cost or budget, 81% with no cited evidence upon which the policy was based, only 50%, so only half of those almost 700 policies had a time frame, and then 76% again with no monitoring or evaluation plan. So they're just set up to fail in so many different ways, and that's before you even get into the politics and the industry lobbying and all the other barriers that you have in policy making. Simply the ideas, the regulation approach and the implementation approach are kind of woefully lacking before you've got into everything else.
At this point, you could just throw up your hands and leave the interview, really. But is there anything that worked?
Yes, I should say, government policy making is hard. And there's lots of reasons why that is, just the nature of government, the nature of democracy. Obesity and food-related ill health is often compared to tobacco. It's kind of unsurprising that only in a 30-year period we haven't sort of cracked it. But there have been these kind of beacons of hope over the last 30 years. Heralded as probably the most successful individual policy is the soft drinks industry levy that was introduced by George Osborne in 2016 and came into force in 2018. And that is the kind of single tax that we've had health tax policy in the food and health space. It's specifically on sugar-sweetened beverages, but the way it's designed is absolutely about encouraging reformulation and giving industry the opportunity to change their product in order to not pay anything. The policy process behind that was really fascinating because it was actually highly secret. So even number 10 were kept totally out of the sort of design and conception stage that took place within the Treasury. And so industry didn't have access, importantly. They couldn't water down the ambition. And then when it was out, industry and civil society and stuff were encouraged to, contribute to the consultation about how to implement it. But it was a kind of fascinating policy process that shows that when a minister at that level decides to act on this and really understands the politics and the evidence, that you can get this kind of beautifully designed policy.
And how important is food industry lobbying?
Industry lobbying plays an enormous role. So there have been numerous reviews published, particularly in the academic literature, and the resounding overarching barrier to obesity and food-related health policy is the influence of industry, whether that's lobbying or the funding of research or the sort of insidious setting of the framing that this isn't a government responsibility. This is, we should just let people eat what they want to eat and choose what they want to choose, and that's dictated by industry providing those options. It can be anything from quite aggressive forms of contact with government through ministers, parliamentarians or whatever, talking about how there will be losses of jobs or, negative impacts on the industry, even if that's built on bogus research. And again, the soft drinks industry levy was a really good example where there were all of these reports published by industry or industry funded bodies saying that the soft drinks industry levy was going to lead to, all these job losses and detrimental effects on business. And actually lots of businesses even benefited from the introduction of the soft drinks industry levy because they diversified their portfolio. And the way that it was designed allowed industry to not be sort of too harmed by it. So industry lobbying operates in lots of different ways.
Dr. Dolly Van Tulleken. We asked the government and food industry for a response. The Department of Health said,
"We're taking strong action to tackle obesity, recognising that it is the second biggest cause of cancer and costs the NHS around £6.5 billion a year. This includes introducing a soft drinks industry levy to cut sugar content, introducing calorie labelling on foods sold in out-of-home settings, and reducing sugar in breakfast cereals. We're going even further and will soon introduce a ban on multi-buy offers on less healthy products and restrict the advertisement of such products."
And a spokesperson from the Food and Drink Federation said,
"Food and drink manufacturers actively support the government's goal to reduce obesity. A key aspect of this has been the substantial investment that companies have made and continue to make to improve the nutritional profile of food and drinks by adapting recipes, launching healthier products, and reducing portion sizes. Working alongside partner organisations, businesses also provide healthy options to breakfast clubs, redistribute surplus food to those who need it, and deliver extensive workplace health initiatives which support the people who work for us and the communities they live in. We believe a holistic, whole systems approach is needed to improve health outcomes, which requires everyone to work together. Consultation on government policy is an essential part of this, and industry is transparent in its responses. Proposed policies should be rigorously examined to consider whether they are likely to achieve the stated outcomes, whether there could be unintended consequences, and whether they are practical to implement. Industry expertise, alongside others, is key to developing the effective, practical policies that we'd all like to see improving diets across the UK.
So in 2024, are there signs of change? 5 years ago, Henry Dimbleby was asked by the government to put together a national food strategy. When it was published, the government praised it and then ignored it. Here he is, a few weeks ago, giving evidence to the House of Lords Food, Diet and Obesity Committee for their inquiry, still taking place, looking at the links between food, diet and obesity.
I sense in government there is, in the Tory party, there is the beginnings of a really fundamental change. There's still a very hotly debated ideological battle about whether we believe in the nanny state. I see now largely that is gradually being overturned, and particularly I think because of the state of the economy. So there was a piece of work that the Institute for Fiscal Studies put out which showed that the overall cost economy was now just under £100 billion a year. And that actually excluded the cost of children and adolescents. And this was just obesity, so not the other things. And so I think now it is impossible to be in government and you can't turn a blind eye to it anymore. But I feel that it is now, the evidence is so completely incontrovertible, the damage to health, the damage to productivity, the damage to people's lives. I mean, it's absolute catastrophe. I'm optimistic because I think it's impossible to ignore anymore.
Henry Dimbleby. That House of Lords Committee on Food, Diet and Obesity will publish their report later this year. So where do we go from here? The Henry charity continues to grow. What they do training local staff to work with families is shown by independent research to work. Henry's CEO, Kim Roberts.
I think one of the things at a national level that would make a huge difference is just that sustained funding, because one of the things that really, I think, did make a difference in Leeds was that it was embedded over a period of years. So Henry has been working at that citywide level through training practitioners and delivering family programmes in children's centres for 20 years now. And that's what you need in order to see population level change.
Which was, of course, Amsterdam's strategy on cutting childhood obesity. We'll give the last word, almost, to Dr. Dolly Van Tulleken on what we need to learn from there if we really do want a healthy future for our children and our country.
A massive thing was the political leadership. So Eric van der Berg, who was the deputy mayor, believed massively in health. And so he kind of reframed the introduction of a whole systems public health programme in the city by saying, well, people don't have the freedom to be healthy because they're so heavily surrounded by unhealthy options. And they also have this phrase, learning by doing, which is really important in public health interventions, that you don't always have the evidence of if something's going to work and how it's going to work without introducing it in the first place. So they were much more experimental and almost entrepreneurial with the policy approach of being open to going, we can't guarantee that we're going to know how this is going to work, but what we are going to do is going to monitor it really closely, and we're going to learn by doing. So naturally, it's the thing that does often hold governments back globally, because they sort of feel that they need to have the evidence of how something's going to work exactly. And because that's virtually impossible, you kind of have to just go for it and monitor it and build the evidence as you go, obviously carefully. And that's exactly the kind of approach that they took in Amsterdam.
Well, now we do know what works in Amsterdam and Leeds. Is there any chance that this government, or the next one, will, as Dolly Van Tulleken put it, go for it? We'll see. Making this programme mattered a lot to producer Sophie Anton and to me. I hope it was another brick in your wall of knowledge. Thanks for listening.
Flexibility is great. That's why there's yoga. Flexibility for your insurance coverage is great too. That's why there's United Healthcare Insurance Plans. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, United Healthcare Insurance Plans offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage for medical, vision, dental, and more. One of these plans may be right for you if you're, say, between jobs, coming off your parents' plan, turning a side hustle into a full hustle, or even missed open enrollment. Want more flexibility? Find out more about United Healthcare Insurance Plans at uh1.com.